This is part one of three over the Italian Renaissance. This lecture corresponds to section 1.1 from your textbook, or pages 74 through 80. Please note the dates on this slide, as the Renaissance took place from 1350 to approximately 1600. The word Renaissance is a French term that translates to mean rebirth. We will be discussing why the term rebirth so aptly applies to the time period from 1350 to 1600. The Renaissance is a transitional time period from the medieval era, what some people would call the Middle Ages or Dark Ages, to what we consider early modern times. The Renaissance was characterized by a renewed interest in learning about ancient Greek and Roman discoveries and cultures. It is also seen as a period for the rebirth of European society after the disorder and chaos of the medieval era. That chaos stemmed from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. Remember, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, is still around at this point and controls what would be modern Turkey and a small amount of territory in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire will last a century longer than the Western Empire and will not crumble until 1453, when it falls to the Ottoman Turks. However, the main part of the empire, which had its seat of power in Rome, Italy, falls to Germanic tribes in 476. After Rome's fall, the stability that the empire provided across most of Europe crumbles, and these tribes that defeated Rome then break up the former Roman territories and start to create new kingdoms. Even though by 476 Rome's territory had been steadily declining, they still had much territory in modern-day Italy, France, and southern European regions. The fall of the empire sparked a very turbulent and violent time in European history, as tribes vied to control new kingdoms and attempted to conquer new regions once held by Rome. So that is how the medieval period starts, with the fall of the Roman Empire and the violent transition period that follows. This isn't to say that the entire medieval era was violent or racked with war. Remember, we are talking about a time period of almost 1,000 years. But the early Middle Ages were certainly a more violent time. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, that ended right before the 300s was totally gone, which made trading over long distances relatively unsafe, and the economy of Europe also drastically changed from the Roman times. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe also loses its unifying educational and engineering presence. The incredible engineering feats of the empire, like their world-renowned road system and aqueduct systems, are no longer maintained and began to crumble. Secular education, like in mathematics, literature, and science, is pushed aside in favor of religious education controlled by the Catholic Church. So the Renaissance will be this incredibly transformative time for Europe in terms of economic systems, religion, education, and in architecture and engineering. The Middle Ages ends with the largest epidemic event up until that point in history, the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. The largest plague outbreak happened between 1347 and 1352 and killed upwards of a third of Europe, or somewhere between 25 to 30 million people. You have to think not only about the psychological effects that have had on people, those remaining to witness the millions of dying, but also about the huge impact on the economy. Remember, during the medieval era, Europe uses the feudal system, where noble landowners use serfs to work their fields and farms. Most serfs are not paid for their labor. They are given small plots of land to farm for their families in exchange for working on a noble's land. This is subsistence farming, where if a serf had anything left over, they could then sell or barter it for other things they needed. However, when millions of people die due to the plague, there's a lot of farmland that needs workers, but far fewer serfs to work the land. This begins a transition in the European economy. Serfs began demanding actual wages or money for their labor, and you see a transition in where people are living. Serfs began to leave the depopulated countryside and migrate to more centralized areas. So you start to see the growth of cities and urban areas as people migrate looking for alternative forms of work. Lastly, the Renaissance marks a rebirth in Western European art and literature, and this becomes known as a golden age. During the Renaissance, there was a growth in the intellectual movement known as humanism. Humanist scholars were interested in studying classical Greek and Roman works. Their hope was that they could use the ancient wisdom to help correct the chaos in their own time. During the Renaissance, you see a shift in what academics or scholars are studying. During the medieval era, the Catholic Church tightly controlled what people could study and research, permitting most to only study religious topics and works. During the Renaissance, there is a shift in the academic community to focusing more on secular or non-religious topics, such as the humanities, which includes languages, history, classical studies, and more. This chart breaks down some of the differences between medieval and Renaissance Europe. The medieval period begins with the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 and ends roughly around 1350 with the start of the Renaissance. The medieval period was dominated by rural or agrarian society. There were some cities, but they were much smaller than what we think of today. The Middle Ages was also a period with few long-distance trade routes and connections for most people in Europe. The majority of people were born in the same village they died in, and they never left. Long-distance travel was dangerous and rare. It could take months just to travel from one country to another. So for most of the population, it was impractical, if not impossible. As previously stated, the Middle Ages is dominated by the Catholic Church. The Church dictated what people could study, and that usually meant only religious topics. Most scholars were members of the Church, monks, who spent their lives studying the religious works in monasteries. The average person in the medieval era was illiterate, meaning they could not read or write. Individual achievement was less highly valued during the medieval era as compared to the Renaissance, and I'll discuss that more later. Lastly, classical works, like those created in ancient Greece and Rome, might have been preserved when found, but were not studied or used. During the Renaissance, in contrast, there is a growth of urban society as people began migrating to cities after the plague, and long-distance trade increases. During the Renaissance, the age of exploration happens, when Europeans began exploring Africa, Asia, and eventually reached the New World or the Americas. Ship and travel technology become better, and Europeans are able to travel further and faster than ever before, including during the medieval period. During the Renaissance, we see a shift towards studying secular subjects and an emphasis on individual achievement. During the Renaissance, the great artists like Da Vinci and Michelangelo are treated like rock stars. Rich and noble families become patrons or sponsors of famous artists to increase their own family's image and prestige in society. This isn't to say art wasn't appreciated or created during the medieval period, but during the Renaissance, art in Western Europe enters a golden age of achievement, and artists are transcended to a celebrity status. Lastly, as I have already mentioned, during the Renaissance era, there's an increased interest in studying the works of ancient Rome and Greece, and then using them to try to shape or correct the future. The Renaissance begins in Italy for a few reasons, but primarily it is related to geography. Italy was the center of the Roman Empire, meaning the Renaissance Italian scholars had easy access to the architectural remains, artwork, and literature of the Romans. Italy also prospered during the Middle Ages, unlike many parts of Europe, and it recovered relatively quickly from the plague. City-states like Florence, Milan, and Venice became very wealthy through trade. Italy, as a peninsula, it is surrounded by water on three sides, which allows the majority of the Italian city-states access to trade routes from all different places. Italy became very wealthy from developing manufacturing industries like leatherworks in Florence or the Italian marble trade. Italy is positioned geographically in the Mediterranean Sea, allowing Italy access to trade from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Italy brought goods into Europe that other countries did not have access to, and as a result, Italy became very wealthy and prosperous. Italy's contact with Muslim traders in the Ottoman Empire increased the growth of humanism. The Roman and Greek empires had conquered much of northern Africa and the Middle East. Through trade, the Ottomans brought back many lost Greek and Roman works into Europe via Italian trade. So looking at this map, you can see Italy. It is the boot shape with Naples being the heel and toe. Look at the different city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence, and see how they are perfectly positioned geographically for trade. These green trade routes connected Italy not only to Europe, but to all different cultures and other continents. This trade prosperity meant Italian city-states had lots of extra money to invest in things like the arts. This is the end of part 1 of 3 on the Italian Renaissance.